Okay, we move on now to the oil production specifically, not simply the oil production, but some implications for the oil production in the region. Because what you'll see, and I'll pick a narrative of events that are all connected. You'll see the incredibly complex warren of oil politics, which compromises everybody who gets involved. Um, I have to pick and choose, and so I'll pick a couple of main issues and follow a line of implications as you keep pulling a string and it keeps pulling the fabric apart and apart and apart. Now, as you can see here, you have a community of oil fields, all these little black splotches in here in and around the Persian Gulf. And mind you, if you're involved in politics in the Persian Gulf, it has to do with oil. There's no other reason to come up in here, quite frankly. All right, it has to do with oil in the 20th century. This is not a major trade and traffic pathway today, hardly. That's the Suez Canal, which is way over here or off the map over here. All right, it's about oil if you're involved in here. Let nobody mislead you about that. In any case, all right. Now, uh, look at this graph here, and you can see that when it comes to oil producers, it would appear that the United States is a major oil producer. It usually is leading or is up there with Saudi Arabia. All right, you can see the Persian Gulf oil producers. All right, Saudi Arabia there. You got Iran, Iraq, UAE, Kuwait, right down the line. All right, so don't be deceived by a graph like this. Now, remember, I was talking to you all about this when we were in Nigeria. All right, let me emphasize the point. What does a graph like this mean? Very little. The fact that the United States is a major oil producer is, in effect, irrelevant because this is the production of oil. That's not the issue. You can produce oil. It's the relevant observation that you want to make is in terms of oil reserves. How much oil do you have in the ground? And the truth emerges when you click over to this graph over here. Here's world oil reserves, all right, oil in the ground. And now you can see the dominance of the Persian Gulf. I've circled all the Persian Gulf countries, and you can see, roughly speaking, on any estimate in a given year, about 2/3 to the world's oil is there. All right. So yes, the United States is a major oil producer, but all of a sudden, notice they almost disappear off this map in terms of oil in the ground. In fact, you can see the United States right over there, just a mere fraction. All right. You can see the Persian Gulf states, and that shows you or indicates to you the prominence of Persian Gulf oil. All right. Now, this unfortunately leads politicians to indulge in something you may be familiar with. You have a look at this image over here, these images. All right. Politicians end up pandering to your ignorance about oil production. The notions often put forth by Republicans and Democrats alike illustrates the cowardice that both parties and other countries have with respect to politics in the region. They often say things like you can see here. By essentially, they're saying if we lower our reliance on Persian Gulf or Middle Eastern oil, all right, we'll be more secure. We won't necessarily have to be involved in Middle East politics. And as I mentioned, I believe a month or two ago, as I mentioned, this is fundamentally incorrect. Fundamentally incorrect. Here's the reality about oil. First off, all right, let's understand this. First off, when we look at when we think about oil production, petroleum oil is fundamental to modern life in the developed world. As you can see here, it fuels, obviously, the automobile. The automobile is the premier symbol of personal freedom and status in the developed world. As the underdeveloped world advances to the developed world, the first thing people tend to want to get is a car. All right? So that's important. But that's not actually the most important or even close to the most important implication of oil. Have a look here. As you can see here, oil is the modern military is run on oil. A strong military that you have to have in a developed country, which you use to shape international politics to your benefit, well, that military runs on oil. It absolutely runs on oil. Everybody remembers the experience of Adolf Hitler in World War II, who, at the end of the day, the principal, if not the co-principal reason for losing that war was unfortunately running out of oil, in any case. Insufficient access to oil. There are other factors, but that was a critical one. All right. So your modern military runs on oil. But even that, you could say, is not necessarily the most important region. It's certainly our other, well, the third one is this here. All right. The vast mass of consumer goods, which people daily consume daily in the developed world, and around which and the activity of which they often construct an identity around, well, that is all imported in and distributed by oil. And of course, the expanse of that, you simply, well, is infinite. All right. That's how central it is to the modern first world life, oil is. And politicians know this. Politicians know this. And that is, if you would, suggested by this cartoon here, or these cartoons. The region is racked by continuous conflict, which most people would not like to get involved with, certainly outsiders, if they had a choice. Now, I've already outlined why the area is historically unstable, going back centuries and centuries, all right, based on geography. That applies to the 20th century, as I'll be showing you momentarily. All right. This region is like a vacuum drawing in outsiders. For example, presently, the United States has often stated, as you can see here, that it is committed to keeping the Straits of Hormuz. This is the Straits of Hormuz over here, open, and using its impressive navy to do so. And the reason why is the Straits, much of the world's oil is flowing out to the world through the Straits of Hormuz. In fact, why the United States has that policy is often, well, is best reflected about what happened in 1993 when Iran seized control of those islands and stationed Chinese silkworm anti-ship missiles on them. And it did so, Iran did, largely for effect. It didn't, nobody suggested it was going to carry out any strikes on oil tankers. Nevertheless, they wanted to get the world's attention because of certain events that were going on, which I'll talk about momentarily. All right, but this alarmed much of the world, depended on that oil. And also associated with that, or fundamentally to this, is if you look at this map here, you might remember this when I was talking about Nigeria. This is a map showing the sources where the United States gets its oil. This is 2003, but it could be any year. I mean, it's by and large going to be distributed. You can see by and large the United States doesn't get that much oil out of the Persian Gulf. Roughly maybe 10 to 20%. It varies on any given year. All right, it gets from the Persian Gulf. Is that relevant that the United States gets very little? No, it makes no difference whether you get 1% or 99% from the Persian Gulf or not. You might as well get it all from there. That's because there's only one oil market. That is to say, if you looked at a country like Venezuela over here, if the United States is getting its oil from, say, Venezuela and Mexico, Nigeria, not the Persian Gulf, all right, what difference does that make if something happens in the Persian Gulf? Oh, I don't know. A war kicks off. There's mines dropped in the Persian Gulf, which occurred in the 90s. What's going to happen is the price of oil is going to spike. And if the price of oil is going to spike, that means the oil you're getting elsewhere from whatever is going to spike at the same time, because these people realize they can get a higher price because of the diminished access. Moreover, if there's some problem in the Persian Gulf and you can't get oil out of here, all the other competitors who want to consume that oil, especially Western Europe and Japan and these countries and China now, they're going to come to where you're getting your oil. Therefore, it's just going to drive the price up the same. So when a politician says we need to cut our imports on Persian Gulf oil, they're pandering. They're pandering to you. Don't buy it. There's only one oil market. Have a look at this graph here to emphasize that one oil market. This is a map, a cartogram. A cartogram shows you, some theme, in this case, oil possession, who has the oil. And the size of the country is proportioned to the amount of oil. And therefore, you can see the immense importance of the Persian Gulf oil producers in here. All right. And you can see how the rest of the world, Western Europe, is even on here. All right. The United States, all of a sudden, they are diminished in scale, dramatically so. Dramatically so. Even though the United States is the #1 consumer, all right, it just doesn't have the oil. All right. That should make the point that the Persian Gulf oil reserves are absolutely fundamental to modern life. I'm not suggesting they should be, I'm just suggesting they are in any case. All right. And by the way, for those of you, because we often have had this discourse, usually when prices of oil go high or something like this, therefore there are those who will say, hey, we got some oil on the North Slope of Alaska, as you could sort of see here. And that we therefore ought to produce more oil domestically. That's fundamentally incorrect, and it's impertinent to the situation. First off, this oil is in difficult circumstances in the high Arctic. It's extremely expensive to produce over here. It's never going to be competitive with Persian Gulf oil, which is really cheap to produce. And since you want the price to go down, that's why you're going to be drilling up here into these circumstances. What's the point of trying to produce cheap oil up here when you can't do it? Not only is it difficult to produce the oil up here in terms of price, but then you got to, as you can see on this map over here, then you got to put it onto the Trans-Alaskan pipeline, and you got to put it on the pipeline, and it's piped all the way across Alaska. Then on the other side at Valdez over here, it's put onto tankers again. Then you got to ship it to the market. All that raises its price. That's not going to solve anything. That's not going to solve anything. More and just as important is there's not enough oil over here. Even if you did produce, I don't know, let me make up a number, 1,000 more barrels of oil up here a day, the Persian Gulf producers or the Saudis can simply going, oh, that's very nice of the United States. You produced 1,000 little more barrels. They can just drop their production by 1,000. And if they drop their production by 1,000, therefore the amount of oil on the market remains the same, and the price stays the same. So it makes no difference that you have this oil up in Alaska. There's not enough of it, and it's too expensive. And I have to point out, with respect to this delusion that people often have, as you can see here, this oil, we keep saying it's our oil. The U.S. has oil. All right? This is large. These are, I believe, the largest oil producer, and I haven't checked in the last few years, but it probably still is BP up here. BP means British Petroleum. These are businesses. They're not going to sell oil to you in the United States at a cheap price because, what, you're an American? Hardly. So there's no such thing as our oil. That oil has largely been privatized through concessions and other things. And if you did want to come up here and control oil and take it over, therefore it's state-owned, not publicly owned. We often complain about state-owned businesses. We say it's socialist and all these other type of things. If you're talking about oil security and America has oil, you're talking socialism, which is many people don't have a problem with, but understand there's going to be a conflict with your other rhetoric against socialism. Okay? People have some delusions that they're servicing here. Therefore, when you get politicians who make statements like this, we must break our dependence on oil imports from the Middle East. Again, you're getting politicians who are just pandering to you. What must you do if you want to break your dependence on the Middle East and all the problematic politics, of which I'll give you some prime examples here momentarily? What do you have to do if you do want to make that true? You want to break your oil dependence. What you need to do is fundamentally cut down or sever your consumption of oil, period. Move on to another energy source. That's what you need to do. And of course, the leadership of a country, left and right, by and large, often is not that courageous. We often put oil men in office directly. They're not going to move in that direction. I believe that's the case over here, Mr. Bush, and even the Vice President Cheney, and of course, oil interests send money to the Democratic Party as well. What you need to do is lower, if not cut, your reliance on oil consumption, period. You move to another energy source. But what politician running for office wants to ask contented and bloated Americans to make a sacrifice and get out of those big cars, cut down on the driving? No, the public will punish a candidate who proposes such madness by not voting for them. And so the politicians just don't say that. Nevertheless, it's astonishing the level of popular ignorance we have about this. Here's a classic case which you might be familiar with. All right. That's a presidential candidate. I believe that was Sarah Palin in 2008, going around screaming, drill, baby, drill. We need, to break our dependence on the Middle East. All right, let's keep drilling. This was an expression of an astonishing ignorance. Astonishing ignorance. You can see how the general public is pandered to. And if you had bought into those type of things, it's understandable. Most of you are on the young side of stuff. But as an adult, you should not be vulnerable anymore to that type of pandering by politicians, in any case. Okay. Now, my point with all that was to emphasize the absolute importance of Persian Gulf oil fields, and now not allow anybody to think you can easily escape involvement with cheap rhetoric coming from political parties or talking heads or people with a hat on screaming, pump this, whatever. Good Lord, you might remember that the ecological tragedy right there in the Gulf there. Was it a year or two ago? I can't remember the year. The Deep Horizon well, that was British Petroleum again, in any case. Okay, now, back to these Persian Gulf oil fields. All right. When large oil fields were discovered in the Persian Gulf in the early 20th century, 1936 to be specific, to be specific about this, all right, the powers of the West rushed in to control it. Now, don't get me wrong, oil has been known to be here for centuries, but of course that would be irrelevant to people since there was no mass market for it. So the fact that the area was known to have this, black gooey substance was irrelevant. It's only when you get an industrial economy that runs on it that you're going to get vast demand and interest in it. Well, what happens in the 30s really is the West comes into control of this oil, and it's sort of logical that that would occur. You remember the Sykes-Picot Agreement that divided up the Middle East between the French and the British at the end of World War I. As you can see, the British here, in red and pink here, were in control, and they were in an excellent position to dominate Persian Gulf oil fields. It's part of the British mandate. And since the British were good allies with the United States after World War I, and the British didn't want to squeeze out the United States, this valuable ally, because remember, the United States replaced the British as the next major capitalist power dominating the world economy. The British cut the United States in to the oil production in the region. And it made sense. Who are the two largest economies consuming oil? Would have been Great Britain. That means they have oil production expertise. And of course, they have the money to develop these oil fields. It made sense that most of the concessions would go to Great Britain and the United States. And you can see that here in this map. All right. You can see how the United States pretty much got control of Saudi concessions in terms of, I'll explain what a concession is in a minute, all right? But got control of Saudi oil, the British dominating Iran oil, and then there was a mixture of the United States, the British, the Dutch, and the French in Iraq. They got concessions to produce oil. Understand the importance of that oil. As I mentioned before, as you can see here in World War II, Hitler wanted to get to these regional oil fields. Unfortunately, he ran into Stalingrad, and some of you are sort of historians of sorts and understand that that put an end to his larger imperial aspirations, certainly in terms of the East, in any case. But what he ultimately wanted to do was move into southern Russia, come into the oil fields in and around the Persian Gulf, ultimately. Especially, and before that, there were oil fields in the Caspian Sea. He never got that accomplished, but it implicates the importance of oil to the Western powers. All right. Okay. Let me explain what an oil concession is on the next tape.